Her marriage to the Duke of Ravenscroft. Lysandra Thorne's cup clattered against its saucer, spilling tea across the faded tablecloth. "Father, you cannot be serious." Percival Thorne slumped in his chair, the letter from the Duke's solicitor clutched in trembling fingers. "The creditors will seize everything by month's end. The shop, the house, even your mother's jewelry." Rain lashed at the windows of their once grand townhouse, a fitting backdrop to the dissolution of Lysandra's future. At 23, with no dowry and a father disgraced by bankruptcy, her prospects had withered to nothing. But this, the notorious Duke of Ravenscroft, Alaric Blackwood, a man whose name was whispered in London drawing rooms with equal parts reverence and fear. "He's a monster," she whispered, recalling the gossip. A cruel aristocrat with eyes of ice who had driven his own brother to exile and refused to dance with any woman at court. "Why would such a man want me for his wife?" "He needs an heir, nothing more," her father said, avoiding her gaze, "and we need his protection." A week later, Lysandra stood at the edge of the Wyndham ballroom, a reluctant pawn in this game of power. Lady Wyndham, her father's last remaining ally in society, had orchestrated this meeting, insisting that Lysandra wear her finest gown, a modest blue silk, painfully outdated, but the best they could manage. "He's here," Lady Wyndham whispered, nudging Lysandra forward as a hush fell over the assembly. The Duke of Ravenscroft entered like a storm cloud, tall and imposing in immaculate black evening wear. His face might have been carved from marble, all sharp angles and cold beauty, framed by raven hair that curled slightly at his collar. But it was his eyes that arrested Lysandra, grey as winter fog and utterly devoid of warmth. Those eyes swept the room with practiced indifference until they found Lysandra. His gaze narrowed slightly, assessing her with the detached interest of a man examining horseflesh at auction. "Miss Thorne," he said, his voice deeper than she had imagined, with the crisp accent of aristocratic privilege. He did not bow, merely inclined his head. "I trust you understand the arrangement proposed between us." "I understand you seek a broodmare, Your Grace, not a wife," Lysandra replied, surprising herself with her boldness. A flash of something, irritation, amusement, crossed his face before the mask of indifference returned. "Indeed, and I understand you seek financial salvation. A fair exchange, is it not?" Before she could respond, they were interrupted by a burst of laughter from nearby. Lysandra turned to see a striking woman in crimson silk, watching them with undisguised interest. "Alaric, darling," the woman purred, approaching with calculated grace, "won't you introduce me to your companion?" "Lady Octavia Willoughby," the Duke said flatly. "Miss Lysandra Thorne." Octavia's smile was a predator's. "Miss Thorne, how unexpected to find you here. I wasn't aware your father's situation allowed for such socializing." Lysandra felt heat rush to her cheeks. "Lady Willoughby, such a quaint gown," Octavia continued, venom wrapped in silk, almost charming in its simplicity. The Duke's expression hardened imperceptibly. "Miss Thorne possesses qualities beyond her wardrobe, Lady Willoughby, qualities increasingly rare in our circles." Octavia's smile faltered. "Of course. The daughter of a failed merchant must have unique talents to attract your notice." The insult hung in the air like poison. Lysandra opened her mouth to respond when the Duke placed a gloved hand lightly at her elbow. "Our dance, I believe," he said, guiding her toward the floor where couples were assembling for a quadrille. "We never agreed to dance," Lysandra whispered as he positioned her opposite him. "No," he replied, "but it was the most efficient way to extract you from a battle you cannot win. Lady Willoughby has ruined better women than you, with less provocation." As the music began, he moved with surprising grace for so formidable a man. "3 days," he said, his voice pitched for her ears alone. "That is how long my solicitor gives your father before complete ruin. I offer you 1 week to consider my proposal." "Why me?" Lysandra asked, executing the steps of the dance automatically. "You could have any woman in London." "Precisely why I choose you, Miss Thorne." His gaze met hers, penetrating and cold. "I have no use for London's simpering debutantes or their scheming mothers. I require a wife who understands that this is a business arrangement, nothing more. No romantic notions, no expectations of love." The music swelled as they circled each other, palm to palm. "And if I refuse?" she asked. A smile touched his lips, devoid of warmth. "Then you and your father may enjoy debtor's prison together. I hear it's quite educational." As the dance ended, he bowed with perfect formality. 1 week, Miss Thorne. I am not a patient man." He turned and strode away. leaving Lysandra frozen on the dance floor, the weight of her family's future crushing down upon her shoulders. The wedding ceremony lasted precisely 17 minutes. No flowers adorned St. George's Chapel, no music filled its hallowed halls. Only the dispassionate voice of the clergyman echoed against stone walls, as Lysandra became, with the exchange of cold vows and a ring too heavy for her finger, the Duchess of Ravenscroft. Alaric did not look at her as they signed the registry, his signature bold and slashing beside her tremulous one. Outside, rain pelted the carriage windows as they rode in silence to Ravenscroft House, his London residence. "Your belongings have been delivered to your chambers," he said, breaking the silence as the carriage rolled through imposing iron gates. "My sister, Lady Isolde, will acquaint you with your duties." "And will you acquaint me with yours, husband?" Lysandra asked, her voice steadier than she felt. His gaze flicked to her, then away. "My duty was fulfilled by placing that ring on your finger. Yours begins with producing an heir." A butler older than time itself opened the carriage door. Ravenscroft House loomed before them, a Georgian monstrosity of stone and glass with windows like watching eyes. "Welcome, Your Grace," the butler intoned with a bow that seemed to cost him physical pain. "Thornfield, this is the Duchess," Alaric said, already striding toward the entrance. The butler examined Lysandra with thinly veiled disapproval. "Indeed." Lysandra lifted her chin, following her husband through doors tall enough for giants. The entrance hall rose 3 stories, dominated by a sweeping staircase and portraits of scowling Blackwoods stretching back generations. "Alaric, finally!" a woman's voice rang from above. Descending the staircase was Lady Isolde Blackwood, tall and regal in black silk that accentuated her pallor. With the same raven hair and storm-grey eyes as her brother, she might have been beautiful if not for the perpetual curl of disdain that shaped her mouth. "So this is the merchant's daughter," Isolde said, circling Lysandra like a hawk assessing prey. "At least she's clean." "Careful, sister," Alaric warned, his tone mild, but carrying an undercurrent of steel. "I am Lady Lysandra Blackwood, Duchess of Ravenscroft," Lysandra said, meeting Isolde's gaze directly. "And you must be the sister I've heard so little about." Isolde's eyes narrowed. "Alaric, your new pet has claws." "Enough," he said. "Show her to the Duchess's chambers. I have correspondence to attend to." He departed without another glance, leaving Lysandra alone with her new sister-in-law. "This way," Isolde said, ascending the stairs. "Try to keep up." The Duchess's chambers occupied the east wing, a suite of rooms last decorated when the previous century was young. Heavy velvet curtains blocked what little daylight braved London's perpetual fog, and the furniture spoke of a bygone elegance now faded to ghostly echoes. "These were my mother's rooms," Isolde said, trailing fingers across a dusty pianoforte. "She died here." Lysandra swallowed. "I'm sorry for your loss." "Are you?" Isolde's smile was a knife. "No matter. Dinner is at 8. Alaric expects punctuality." She paused at the door. "One more thing. The blue room at the end of the north corridor is locked for a reason. Do not attempt to enter it." 3 days passed in oppressive silence. Lysandra took meals alone, explored the labyrinthine house, and met the small army of servants who regarded her with the same suspicion one might offer a fox in a henhouse. On the 4th night, Alaric informed her through his valet that they would be hosting dinner for several important associates. Lord and Lady Harrington arrived first, followed by the ancient Earl of Wexford, and finally, to Lysandra's dismay, Lady Octavia Willoughby accompanied by her father, Viscount Willoughby. "Your Grace?" Octavia curtsied to Alaric with practiced elegance before turning to Lysandra with viper's eyes. "And the new Duchess? How domestic Ravenscroft House has become." Dinner was an exercise in aristocratic warfare. Lysandra, seated opposite her husband at the vast mahogany table, weathered barbed questions about her father's business failure and thinly veiled references to her unsuitable background. "Tell me, Duchess," Lady Harrington said, examining Lysandra through a jeweled lorgnette, "how does one transition from shopkeeper's daughter to mistress of Ravenscroft? The adjustment must be overwhelming." Before Lysandra could respond, the young footman serving wine stumbled, spilling red liquid across the pristine tablecloth. A hush fell over the table. "Clumsy fool!" Lord Harrington snapped, raising his hand. "It was my fault," Lysandra said quickly. "I moved my chair just as he was pouring." 6 pairs of eyes turned to her in astonishment. "Defending servants, Duchess?" Octavia laughed lightly. "How charitable." "Not charity, Lady Willoughby. Justice." Lysandra met her husband's unreadable gaze. The boy didn't deserve punishment for my mistake. The footman, no more than 16 with terror in his eyes, shot her a look of desperate gratitude. You may go, Alaric told the boy, his voice neutral. Then, to the table, my wife brings fresh perspectives to Ravencroft. Perhaps some traditions warrant reconsideration, Lord Harrington harumphed. Next, you'll tell us she's instituting reforms for the factory workers. And if I were, Lysandra asked, surprising herself with her boldness, is it not the duty of those with privilege to consider those without? A strained silence followed, broken by the Earl of Wexford's unexpected chuckle. By God, Ravencroft, you've married a revolutionary. Later, as the gentlemen retired for brandy and the ladies for tea, Octavia cornered Lysandra in the drawing room. He'll tire of you, she whispered, her breath hot against Lysandra's ear. Alaric doesn't tolerate disruption to his ordered world. Ask his brother. His brother? Lysandra frowned. Octavia's smile was triumphant. Oh dear, he hasn't told you about Thaddeus. How fascinating. Before Lysandra could inquire further, Alaric appeared at the drawing room door. His eyes found hers across the room, and for the first time since their wedding, he truly looked at her, with something that, if not approval, at least approached curiosity. The winter storm howled like a wounded beast, rattling the windows of Ravencroft House. Lysandra paced the library, thumbing through leather-bound volumes without absorbing a word. 2 weeks of marriage had established a pattern. Alaric vanished into his study from dawn until dinner. They exchanged perhaps a dozen stilted words over the meal, and then he disappeared again, presumably to work or to his club. Tonight, however, the storm had kept him home. Lysandra had glimpsed him entering the library hours earlier and decided to avoid the room until Thornfield delivered an urgent message requiring the Duke's signature. She found him slumped at his desk, papers scattered around him. "Your Grace?" she called, approaching cautiously. No response. Closer now, she saw his face flushed with unnatural color, his breathing labored. "Alaric," she touched his forehead and gasped at the burning heat. "You're ill." His eyes fluttered open, grey irises clouded with fever. "Leave me," he rasped. "I will not," she said, already pulling the bell rope to summon servants. "You need a physician immediately." When Dr. Reynolds finally battled through the storm to reach them, his diagnosis was swift. Influenza, virulent and dangerous. "He requires constant care," the physician said. "I'll send a nurse in the morning." "That won't be necessary," Lysandra replied. "I'll tend to him myself." Thornfield looked scandalized. "Your Grace, such matters are for staff to handle. It's most irregular for a duchess to—" "I am aware of what's irregular, Thornfield," Lysandra cut him off, "but he is my husband, and I will care for him." Isolde, lurking in the doorway, gave a humorless laugh. "Playing the devoted wife, are we? How quaint." Lysandra ignored her, already arranging for Alaric to be moved to his bedchamber and gathering supplies for the night ahead. For 3 days and nights, she barely left his side. She bathed his burning forehead with cool cloths, coaxed broth and medicine between his cracked lips, and changed sweat-soaked sheets with the help of a reluctant maid. On the 3rd night, his fever peaked. Delirious, he thrashed against the bedclothes, calling out in anguish, "Father, no! The carriage! Check the wheels!" Lysandra pressed a cool cloth to his brow. "Shh! You're safe." His eyes opened, seeing something or someone beyond her. "Octavia, why? I would have given you everything." Lysandra froze, her hand suspended in mid-air. The contract, Father's signature. Thaddeus knew. He always knew. Alaric's voice broke on a sob. "My fault. All of it." She captured his flailing hand between hers. "It's not your fault, Alaric. Rest now." "Don't leave," he whispered, gripping her fingers with surprising strength. "Everyone leaves." "I'm here," she promised, settling beside him on the bed. "I won't leave you." Dawn broke on the 4th day with pale winter sunlight streaming through parted curtains. Lysandra awoke with a start, still seated against the headboard. Alaric's head nestled against her shoulder. His breathing was deep and even, his skin cool beneath her fingers. The fever had broken. She tried to slip away without waking him, but his eyes opened, clear now, and sharply focused on her face. "You stayed," he said, his voice hoarse but lucid. "Of course I stayed. You were ill." He struggled to sit up, grimacing at his weakness. "Why? Why would you care for me yourself? We're strangers. We're husband and wife," she corrected gently. "In sickness and in health, remember?" Something shifted in his expression, a hairline crack in the ice. I remember very little of the past days. Relief flooded her. He didn't recall his fevered confessions. You should rest. Doctor, Reynolds will want to examine you. He caught her wrist as she rose. Lysandra, her name spoken for the first time since their wedding. Thank you. By week's end, Alaric had recovered enough to resume some duties, though Lysandra insisted he remain at home rather than venture out in the continuing cold. To her surprise, he acquiesced without argument. One evening, she found him in the library, examining the bookshelves with a frown. Is something wrong? She asked. They're all wrong, he said. Completely disorganized, histories mixed with poetry, scientific treatises jumbled with Gothic novels. She surveyed the shelves. I could help organize them if you like. He glanced at her with skepticism. You're familiar with library cataloging? My father sold books before expanding to other merchandise, she explained. I managed his inventory from the time I was 12. A silence stretched between them, not uncomfortable, but contemplative. Very well, he finally said. I suppose we could work on it together when time permits. For the next week, they spent evenings in the library, sorting volumes into careful piles. Alaric revealed unexpected knowledge of literature, quoting passages from memory as they worked. Lysandra discovered his preference for poetry, Wordsworth and Blake especially, though he tried to hide this beneath a veneer of scholarly interest. This one's quite worn, she noted one night, handling a small volume of Blake's Songs of Innocence and Experience. My mother's, he said, taking it gently from her hands. She read to me from it every night, even when my father disapproved of such sentimental nonsense. Tell me about her, Lysandra ventured. Alaric's expression clouded. She was different, warm in a cold house. She taught music before marrying my father, pianoforte and voice. His fingers traced the book's spine. She died when I was 14, a carriage accident. I'm sorry, Lysandra said. I lost my mother young as well, to consumption. He looked at her then, truly looked at her, as if seeing past the title of wife to the woman beneath. What was she like, your mother? Kind. Lysandra smiled at distant memories. She smelled of lavender and baking bread. She taught me to read, to sew, to stand straight even when things were difficult. She taught you well, he said quietly. The moment hung between them, fragile as spun glass. Then Thornfield appeared at the door. A message from Lady Willoughby, Your Grace, he announced, presenting a gilt-edged card on a silver tray. She requests your presence at her musicale next Thursday. The intimate atmosphere evaporated instantly. Alaric's face resumed its customary mask of indifference as he took the invitation. We shall attend, he said, not meeting Lysandra's gaze. We? She echoed. Yes. His tone brooked no argument. It's time London society becomes accustomed to its newest duchess. After he strode from the room, Lysandra remained among the piles of books, wondering why Octavia Willoughby's name on an invitation could rebuild the walls that Blake and Wordsworth had begun to dismantle. Lady Willoughby's musical proved even more excruciating than Lysandra had anticipated. The Willoughby townhouse dripped with ostentation, chandeliers throwing diamond light over gilt furniture, and floral arrangements taller than children. But it was the whispers that cut deepest, following Lysandra like persistent shadows. Merchant's daughter bought her way in. Poor Alaric. Necessary evil. She stood rigid beside her husband, who had barely spoken during their carriage ride. Now he nodded at acquaintances with practiced civility, while maintaining a careful distance from her, close enough to appear proper, far enough to avoid genuine connection. Duchess, Lady Octavia approached, resplendent in emerald silk that highlighted her porcelain complexion. How brave of you to come. These gatherings must be so different from what you're accustomed to. Indeed, Lysandra replied. There's considerably more peacock feathers on display, both in the decor and the company. Octavia's smile tightened. Alaric, you must hear Signora Bellini's aria. She's just arrived from Milan. She placed a possessive hand on his arm. You always did appreciate a skilled soprano. Before Lysandra could respond, Octavia had swept Alaric away toward the performance room, leaving her stranded among hostile stares. Don't let her rattle you, came a male voice at her elbow. Octavia's claws are sharp but predictable. Lysandra turned to find a gentleman with intelligent eyes and an amused expression watching her. Unlike the other men present, his attire was unfashionably simple, his cravat tied without pretension. Lord Harmond, he introduced himself with a bow. Ravencroft and I were at Cambridge together. You're the botanist, she realized. My husband mentioned your work on alpine flora. Surprise and pleasure crossed his features. He did. Well, that's something. Alaric doesn't waste words on subjects he finds trivial. Which subjects are those? She asked, genuinely curious. Most of them, Lord Harmond laughed, but particularly society gossip, horse racing, and the marriage market, which makes his choice of you all the more intriguing. How flattering, she said dryly. It was meant to be. His expression sobered. Ravencroft has been a shell since the tragedy. Seeing him with someone who matches his intellect, rather than his bank account, gives some of us hope. Before she could question him further, the music began. Lord Harmond escorted her to a seat at the back of the performance room, where she watched Alaric sitting stiffly beside Octavia in the front row. Signora Bellini possessed a magnificent voice, her Italian aria soaring to the painted ceiling. Yet it was Alaric who captured Lysandra's attention. The slight tension in his shoulders, the almost imperceptible movement of his fingers against his thigh, keeping time with the music. He loves this, she realized. He feels it deeply. The journey home passed in silence until Lysandra gathered her courage. You enjoy music, Alaric glanced at her, then back out the carriage window. A reasonable observation. Your fingers kept tempo during the aria, and when Signora Bellini hit the high F in the second movement, you closed your eyes briefly. His gaze snapped to hers. You were watching me rather than the performance. You were more interesting. Something flickered across his face. Surprise, perhaps, or discomfort at being observed so closely. My mother's influence, he said eventually. She believed music revealed more truth than words ever could. A wise woman. She would have liked you, he said quietly, then seemed startled by his own admission. The carriage lurched to a halt, saving him from further conversation. 2 days later, Lysandra ventured into the village near Ravencroft House. The February cold bit through her woolen cloak as she visited the small lending library and the apothecary. On her return, she passed the parish church just as children were emerging from their lessons, thin faces pinched with cold. Your Grace, the vicar, Mr. Collins, hurried to greet her. What an unexpected pleasure. I was just returning from the village, she explained. Are these your students? Indeed. We manage lessons 3 days a week, though our resources are limited. Lysandra noticed several children without proper coats, their small hands red with cold. One little girl wore only a threadbare shawl over her dress. Do we not provide support for the parish school? She asked. The vicar hesitated. The previous duke was most generous. Since his passing, certain arrangements have lapsed. That evening, Lysandra found Alaric in his study, examining estate ledgers. We need to resume funding for the village school, she said without preamble. The children lack basic necessities, proper coats, school materials. He looked up, brow furrowed. You visited the village? I did, and I'm quite capable of taking a carriage 3 miles without male accompaniment before you object. I was going to ask what else you observed, not criticize your independence. His tone held more curiosity than censure. Encouraged, she described the village's needs, not just the school, but repairs to cottages, medical supplies for the elderly, resources for widows struggling to support families. Alaric listened without interruption, then opened a drawer and extracted a leather-bound ledger. The estate steward submitted these recommendations last quarter. I've been meaning to review them. Together they examined the accounts, identifying where funds could be allocated. Lysandra's experience managing her father's business proved unexpectedly valuable as she suggested efficiencies and priorities. You have a mind for numbers, Alaric remarked, genuine admiration in his voice. Don't sound so surprised, Your Grace. Women can count past 10, despite what Parliament might believe. A noise escaped him. Not quite a laugh, but closer than she'd yet witnessed. I stand corrected, Duchess. The snow began 2 days later, thick flakes swirling from leaden skies. By evening, drifts piled against the windows of Ravencroft House. Lysandra was reading in her chambers when Thornfield knocked urgently. His Grace requests your presence immediately, madam. She found Alaric in the entrance hall, giving instructions to several servants. There's a situation at Hightor Cottage, he explained when he saw her. The roof partially collapsed under the snow. A family with 3 children needs evacuation. I'll prepare rooms for them here, she said instantly. No need. I've arranged accommodations at the Crown Inn until repairs can be made. He shrugged into a heavy coat. I'm riding out with the rescue party. In this storm? That's madness. These are my tenants. My responsibility. Then I'm coming with you. Absolutely not. The children will be frightened. A woman's presence may help. Their eyes locked in silent battle, neither willing to yield. The carriage will follow the riders, he finally conceded. You may join us, but you'll remain inside it, unless I determine it's safe. The journey was treacherous, wind howling across the moors as their small convoy fought through deepening snow. A mile from the cottage, the carriage could go no further. Despite Alaric's protests, Lysandra insisted on continuing on horseback. By the time they reached High Tor, her toes were numb and her face burned with cold. The cottage stood on exposed ground, half its roof crushed beneath snow and fallen beams. Inside, they found the Mercer family huddled in the only safe corner, parents, grandmother, and 3 children under 10. Your Grace, Mr. Mercer stumbled to his feet. We never expected. Gather what you can carry, Alaric ordered. We must leave before the storm worsens. Mrs. Mercer tried to rise but collapsed with a cry of pain. My ankle. When the beam fell, Lysandra knelt beside her. We'll need a stretcher. Impossible in these conditions, Alaric said. I'll carry her. While the men secured the cottage, Lysandra helped the children gather precious possessions: a worn doll, a wooden horse, a family Bible. The youngest girl, no more than 4, sobbed uncontrollably until Lysandra removed her own fur-lined cloak and wrapped it around the child. Brave girl, she whispered. Adventure awaits. Alaric watched this exchange, a strange expression crossing his face before he turned away to organize their departure. Halfway back to the road, the storm intensified to blinding fury. The group became separated, and Lysandra found herself alone with Alaric and 2 of the children, visibility reduced to mere feet. There's a gamekeeper's cottage nearby, he shouted over the wind. We need shelter immediately. They stumbled through drifts until a small stone building materialized from the whiteness. Alaric forced the door with his shoulder, ushering them into blessed stillness. The cottage was a single room with a stone fireplace, abandoned but intact. Alaric quickly kindled a fire, while Lysandra settled the exhausted children on the room's only cot. The others will have turned back to High Tor, Alaric said, rubbing feeling back into his hands. We'll have to wait out the worst here. As the children finally slept, Lysandra and Alaric sat before the meager fire, the storm's fury gradually diminishing to occasional gusts. You were remarkable today, he said unexpectedly. I did what anyone would do. No, his gaze held hers, firelight casting his features in gold and shadow. Most duchesses of my acquaintance would sooner die than risk their complexions in a snowstorm, let alone give their cloak to a tenant's child. Perhaps you've been acquainted with the wrong duchesses. Something almost like a smile touched his lips. Perhaps I have. Dawn broke over a transformed world. The storm had passed, leaving pristine white drifts under a flawless blue sky. Alaric opened the cottage door to blinding sunlight reflecting off snow. The path should be passable now, he said. We can rejoin the others. The sleeping children stirred, blinking in confusion at their unfamiliar surroundings. Lysandra smoothed their tousled hair, whispering reassurances. Thank you, lady, the older boy said solemnly, for staying with us when the storm monsters came. She smiled. There are no monsters, only wind and snow. Still scary, he insisted. Yes, she agreed, meeting Alaric's gaze over the child's head. But facing fears becomes easier when you're not alone. Something unspoken passed between them, a momentary connection cut short when shouts echoed outside. Rescue parties had set out at first light, and soon they were surrounded by relieved servants and reunited with the rest of the Mercer family. The journey back to Ravencroft House passed in a blur of exhaustion. Upon arrival, Lysandra immediately arranged for hot baths, fresh clothing, and chambers for the Mercers until their cottage could be repaired. The East Wing guest rooms should suffice, she told Mrs. Benson, the housekeeper, whose pinched expression conveyed clear disapproval. Tenant farmers in the East Wing. It's most irregular, Your Grace. Irregularity seems to be my specialty, Lysandra replied with steel beneath her smile. Please see to it immediately. Only after ensuring the family's comfort did she seek her own chambers, where she collapsed into bed still fully dressed and slept until late afternoon. She awoke to find a small package beside her pillow, a leather-bound volume of Elizabeth Barrett Browning's sonnets. No note accompanied it, but she knew instantly who had left it there. Alaric had quoted Barrett Browning during their work in the library, though he'd tried to disguise his appreciation with scholarly detachment. That evening he did not appear for dinner. Thornfield informed her stiffly that His Grace had been called to London on urgent business and would return in several days. 4 days stretched to a week, then 10 days. Lysandra filled her time by organizing a proper inventory of the library, visiting the village school, and secretly exploring the vast, neglected gardens behind Ravencroft House. Once magnificent, they had fallen into disarray. Marble fountains choked with weeds, topiary overgrown into misshapen monsters. She was sketching plans for garden restoration when Isolde found her. "Playing at being mistress of Ravencroft?" Alaric's sister asked, eyebrow arched in disdain. "I am mistress of Ravencroft," Lysandra replied calmly, though her heart quickened with irritation. Isolde laughed, a sound devoid of humor. "For now, perhaps, until Alaric tires of this experiment." "Is that what you believe our marriage to be?" "What else? My brother needs an heir, not a merchant's daughter playing duchess." Isolde circled the weathered garden bench where Lysandra sat. "Did you know he was engaged once before? To Octavia?" Lysandra kept her expression neutral despite the twist in her stomach. Ancient history. Not so ancient. They were perfectly matched. Bloodline, wealth, connections, until the accident that killed our parents. Isolde's grey eyes, so like her brother's, sharpened with malice. After that, Alaric changed, broke the engagement with no explanation. Octavia was devastated. "Yet she seems remarkably recovered," Lysandra observed. "She still loves him. Everyone knows it." Isolde leaned closer. "Tell me, do you imagine he married you for anything beyond your womb and the convenience of a wife who wouldn't ask inconvenient questions?" The barb struck true, but Lysandra refused to show pain. "Why such animosity, Lady Isolde? What have I done to earn your contempt?" Something flickered across Isolde's face, vulnerability quickly masked by scorn. "You don't belong here. You never will." She turned to leave, then paused. "Stay away from the music room, by the way. It's been locked since our mother died, and Alaric doesn't allow anyone inside." Lysandra watched her go, wondering which would prove more dangerous, Isolde's open hostility or Octavia's carefully veiled threats. When Alaric finally returned from London, a strange tension accompanied him. He joined Lysandra for dinner but spoke little, his mind clearly elsewhere. Only when Thornfield had withdrawn did he address her directly. "I saw your father in London." Lysandra's fork clattered against her plate. "My father? Is he well?" "Well enough. He's taken rooms in Cheapside, working as a clerk for Harrington Shipping." Relief washed through her, followed by a pang of guilt. She had written to her father weekly, but received only brief formal responses. "Thank you for telling me." Alaric's expression remained unreadable. "He asked about you, seemed concerned that I might be mistreating you. And what did you tell him?" "The truth, that you've made yourself indispensable to Ravencroft in a remarkably short time." The compliment, unexpected and seemingly sincere, warmed her more than it should have. "Thank you for the book," she said. "Barrett Browning is a favorite of mine as well." He looked away, almost embarrassed. "I noticed your interest when we discussed her work." A fragile moment stretched between them, neither certain how to navigate this tentative rapport. "I've been exploring the gardens," she said finally. "They must have been beautiful once." "My mother's passion," he replied. "After she died, no one had the heart to maintain them. Would you object if I attempted some restoration?" "Nothing extravagant, just clearing the worst of the overgrowth." He studied her, surprise evident in his expression. "You garden?" "I'm no expert, but I understand the basic principles. My mother kept a small garden behind our shop. It was her sanctuary from the noise of the city." His eyes softened at the mention of her mother. "Do as you wish with the gardens. They've been neglected too long." The next morning, Lysandra woke to the sound of voices beneath her window. Looking out, she saw Alaric speaking with an older man she didn't recognize. They stood amid the tangled gardens, gesturing toward the crumbling fountains and weed-choked paths. At breakfast, she asked about the visitor. "Mr. Hamilton," Alaric replied, not meeting her gaze. "A garden architect from London." "I see." She sipped her tea, hiding her smile. "Coming to assess the disaster." "Coming to implement your plans, actually." He glanced up, almost shy. "Your sketches were quite detailed. I thought professional assistance might be welcome." "That's unexpectedly thoughtful, Alaric." He cleared his throat. "The Ravencroft gardens were once famous throughout the county. It seems a waste to let them decay further." Over the following weeks, a curious rhythm developed. Mornings, Lysandra worked with Mr. Hamilton in the gardens. Afternoons, she managed household matters or visited the village. Evenings, she and Alaric dined together before retiring to the library, where conversation gradually flowed more easily between them. He revealed himself in small ways, his dry wit, his extensive knowledge of poetry and history, his unexpected concern for the estate's tenants. She found herself watching him when he wasn't aware, cataloguing the minute changes in his expression when something pleased or troubled him. One evening, after discussing a particularly controversial political treatise, she realized they had been talking for hours without noticing the time. Alaric seemed to realize it as well, a bemused expression crossing his face. "It's late," he said, rising abruptly. "You must be tired." "Not particularly." She stood as well, suddenly aware of their proximity in the secluded corner of the library they had claimed. "Thank you for the discussion. It's refreshing to speak freely without worrying about propriety or judgment. Is that how you feel with me now?" he asked quietly. "Free from judgment?" "Increasingly," she admitted, "though you remain the most inscrutable man of my acquaintance." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Perhaps that's for the best, Duchess." The following morning, Lysandra woke to find Ravencroft House in an uproar. Servants scurried through hallways, carrying linens and polishing silver. Mrs. Benson directed the chaos with military precision. "What's happening?" Lysandra asked, catching a harried-looking maid. "Spring planting festival, Your Grace," the girl explained. "Always a grand affair at Ravencroft. Tradition for generations." Lysandra found Alaric in his study, reviewing guest lists. "Were you planning to inform me about this festival, or was I to discover it when guests arrived on our doorstep?" He looked up, genuinely contrite. "Forgive me. With the garden renovations, I assumed you knew. It's held annually when the first spring plantings begin, a tradition my mother instituted to celebrate the season with tenants and neighbors alike. And when is this momentous occasion?" "Tomorrow." "Tomorrow?" She stared at him in disbelief. "You expect me to prepare for a major social event with one day's notice?" "The preparations are well in hand," he assured her. "Mrs. Benson has managed it for years." "That's not the point, Alaric. As Mistress of Ravencroft, I should have been consulted." He had the grace to look abashed. "You're right, it was thoughtless of me." "Yes, it was." She turned to leave, then paused. "Will Lady Willoughby be attending?" Something complicated passed across his face. "She always has." The festival dawned clear and mild, perfect weather for outdoor celebrations. Lysandra dressed carefully in a gown of spring green silk, her first new dress since the wedding, sewn by the village dressmaker, rather than a London modiste. The simplicity suited her, emphasizing her slender figure and bringing out the golden highlights in her chestnut hair. Alaric waited at the foot of the grand staircase, handsome in a midnight blue coat that emphasized the breadth of his shoulders. When he saw her, his eyes widened almost imperceptibly. "You look," he began, then seemed to reconsider whatever he had been about to say. "The green suits you." "High praise indeed, Your Grace," she teased, taking his offered arm. "I'm not skilled at compliments," he admitted, as they walked toward the gardens. "But you are beautiful, Lysandra, increasingly so." The sincerity in his voice caught her off guard, sending warmth coursing through her veins. Before she could respond, they emerged onto the south terrace, where dozens of guests already mingled beneath a spring sky. The festival transformed Ravencroft. Tents of white canvas dotted the newly restored gardens, filled with flowers, seedlings, and displays of traditional crafts. Villagers mingled with gentry, children darted between exhibits, and musicians played lively country tunes near the central fountain, now flowing clear for the first time in years. Lysandra moved through the crowds beside Alaric, acutely aware of the scrutiny they faced as a couple. The local gentry observed them with calculating eyes, measuring every interaction, while villagers bobbed curtsies and bows with a warmth that surprised her. "You've made quite an impression on the tenants," Alaric murmured as an elderly woman pressed a bouquet of early primroses into Lysandra's hands, with heartfelt thanks for her kindness to her grandchildren during the winter storm. "I've done very little," she demurred. "You've done more than any Ravencroft mistress in decades," he corrected. "They notice such things." Before she could respond, a familiar voice cut through the pleasant hum of conversation. "Alaric, darling, how perfectly charming." Octavia Willoughby approached, resplendent in lavender silk that complemented her raven hair. She was accompanied by her father, the Viscount, and a tall gentleman Lysandra didn't recognize. "Lady Willoughby," Alaric acknowledged with a slight bow. "Viscount, I'm pleased you could attend." "We wouldn't miss it for the world," Octavia gushed, placing a proprietary hand on Alaric's arm. "Your mother's spring festival was always the highlight of the country calendar." "Indeed," the Viscount agreed, barely acknowledging Lysandra's presence. "Ravencroft traditions must be preserved." The unspoken implication hung in the air, despite its unconventional mistress. Octavia turned to the stranger beside her. "May I present my cousin, Lord Thaddeus Blackwood, recently returned from travels abroad?" Lysandra felt, rather than saw, Alaric stiffen. The man before them could have been Alaric's ghost. Same height, similar features, though his eyes held none of Alaric's intensity. Instead, they gleamed with calculated charm. "Cousin," Thaddeus extended his hand to Alaric, who hesitated barely a heartbeat before accepting it. "How long has it been?" 8 years. 9, Alaric replied, his voice devoid of emotion. "And this must be the new Duchess of Ravencroft." Thaddeus turned to Lysandra with a flourish. "Enchanted, Your Grace. Tales of your beauty have clearly been understated." He bowed over her hand with exaggerated gallantry, his lips lingering against her glove slightly longer than propriety dictated. "Lord Blackwood," she acknowledged, withdrawing her hand as soon as possible. "You're related to my husband?" "Distant cousins," Alaric interjected. "Very distant." "Not so distant," Thaddeus corrected with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "My father and yours were second cousins, which makes us third cousins once removed. The Blackwood family tree has many tangled branches, some of which should have been pruned long ago," Alaric said coldly. Octavia laughed, a brittle sound designed to dispel tension. "Such family warmth. Thaddeus has been abroad for so long. Egypt, Constantinople, the Far East. He's full of the most fascinating stories." "I'm sure he is," Alaric said, placing his hand at the small of Lysandra's back. "If you'll excuse us, we must greet the other guests." "Of course." Thaddeus smiled, something predatory in his gaze. "We'll have ample time to reacquaint ourselves. I plan to remain in England for some time." As they moved away, Lysandra felt Alaric's tension in the rigid set of his shoulders. "I take it you and your cousin are not close." "Thaddeus Blackwood is no relation, I acknowledge," he said in a voice pitched for her ears alone. "Be wary of him, Lysandra. He's not to be trusted." Before she could question him further, they were surrounded by local dignitaries requiring attention. The day progressed in a whirl of introductions and conversations, Alaric maintaining a facade of pleasant detachment while never straying far from her side. As dusk approached, servants lit lanterns throughout the gardens, transforming the space into a magical realm of soft golden light. Guests gathered in the central pavilion for traditional spring dances, the music turning from country reels to more refined waltzes as the evening advanced. "Come," Alaric said unexpectedly, offering his hand. "We should open the dancing." Lysandra placed her fingers in his, surprised. "I didn't know you danced." "Rarely," he admitted, as he led her to the center of the pavilion. "But tonight seems an appropriate exception." Eyes followed them as he drew her into his arms, maintaining a proper distance while still holding her more closely than he ever had before. The music began, and he guided her with unexpected grace through the steps of the waltz. "You move well," he observed. "My father insisted on dancing lessons," she replied. "He believed accomplishments would compensate for our lack of pedigree. Your father was wiser than I initially judged." "He's a good man," she said softly. "Flawed, perhaps, but with kind intentions." Something passed across Alaric's face. Not quite pain, not quite regret. The road to ruin is often paved with kind intentions. The dance ended too soon. As they parted, Thaddeus materialized beside them, smoothly inserting himself between Alaric and Lysandra. "Might I claim the next dance with the beautiful Duchess?" he asked with practiced charm. Before Alaric could object, the Viscount appeared, demanding his attention for an urgent matter regarding county politics. With evident reluctance, Alaric allowed himself to be drawn away as Thaddeus swept Lysandra back onto the dance floor. "At last, a moment to become acquainted," Thaddeus said, his hand at her waist holding her closer than propriety allowed. "The mysterious commoner who captured the infamous Duke of Ice. Is that what they call my husband?" she asked lightly, trying to increase the distance between them. "Among other things, the exile is another favorite, after he banished his own brother from England. You speak as if you know him well." "I knew him," Thaddeus corrected, "before grief and guilt transformed him into the man you married." Despite her discomfort, curiosity burned within her. "Guilt for what?" His smile was a knife edge. "He hasn't told you. Fascinating. Perhaps the Duke keeps more secrets from his Duchess than I imagined. Or perhaps you enjoy creating discord where none exists." "Discord?" He laughed softly. "My dear Duchess, discord is the Blackwood family's natural state. Didn't you wonder why the name Thaddeus caused such a reaction in your husband?" "I assumed poor manners were sufficient explanation." His grip tightened slightly. "Wit becomes you. But it won't protect you from truths Alaric has hidden." "What truths?" About the night his parents died, about the real reason for his broken engagement to Octavia. Thaddeus leaned closer, his breath warm against her ear. About the true circumstances of your own father's financial ruin. Lysandra missed a step, faltering momentarily before recovering. My father's business failed due to investments in a shipping venture that sank during a storm. Is that what you believe? Thaddeus's eyes glittered with malicious delight. How convenient. But then Alaric has always excelled at constructing neat narratives that absolve him of responsibility. The music ended, and Lysandra pulled away immediately. If you'll excuse me, Lord Blackwood. Of course. He bowed with exaggerated courtesy. But remember this, Duchess. In the Blackwood family, nothing is as it seems. Not titles, not marriages, and certainly not accidents. She turned away, heart pounding, to find Alaric watching them from across the pavilion, his expression thunderous. Before she could reach him, Octavia intercepted her, a glass of champagne in each hand. You seemed in need of refreshment after that energetic dance, she said, offering a glass. Lysandra accepted reflexively, though the last thing she wanted was Octavia's false camaraderie. Thank you. Thaddeus is quite the accomplished dancer, isn't he? Octavia sipped her champagne, watching Lysandra over the rim. Among his many talents. Indeed, I should warn you, he and Alaric have a rather complex history. So I gathered. Octavia tilted her head, studying Lysandra with calculating eyes. How little you know about the man you married. It must be terrifying being so completely in the dark. I know enough. Do you? Octavia's smile was pitying. Do you know why he broke our engagement? Why he sent his own brother into exile? Why he refuses to enter the music room? The questions matched Thaddeus's insinuations too closely for coincidence. I know that both you and Lord Blackwood seem inordinately interested in undermining my marriage, Lysandra replied evenly, which suggests my husband's happiness threatens you in some way. Anger flashed across Octavia's perfect features before she masked it with a laugh. Happiness? Oh, my dear. Alaric Blackwood hasn't known happiness since the night his parents died. A night, I might add, when your father was curiously present at Ravencroft. Lysandra's champagne glass froze halfway to her lips. What did you say? Ask him, Octavia suggested, triumph evident in her voice. Ask your husband why Percival Thorne was meeting with the old Duke the very night of the accident. Ask why your father's business began failing immediately afterward. Such fascinating coincidences, don't you think? Before Lysandra could respond, a commotion erupted across the pavilion. Raised voices, a woman's scream, then servants rushing toward a figure collapsed on the ground. Alaric knelt beside the fallen guest, his face grim as he barked orders to the footman. Lysandra hurried forward, pushing through the murmuring crowd. On the ground lay Lord Harmond, the botanist, clutching his stomach in obvious distress. Poison, he gasped, looking at Alaric with pain-glazed eyes. The wine. Tastes like almonds. Get Dr. Reynolds immediately, Alaric commanded a footman before turning to the crowd. No one else touched the wine. Harmond convulsed suddenly, his body arching in agony before going limp. Dr. Reynolds arrived moments later, but one look at the botanist's still form confirmed what everyone already knew. The botanist was dead. Lysandra met Alaric's gaze across the victim's body, shock mirrored in both their expressions. Behind her, she heard Thaddeus Blackwood's voice pitched to carry through the stunned silence. How tragic, he said. It seems death still stalks Ravencroft, just as it did 9 years ago. Chapter 7. Secrets Unearthed. The days following Lord Harmond's death passed in a blur of magistrates' inquiries and hushed speculation. Servants removed all traces of celebration from the gardens, as if erasing evidence of joy might somehow diminish the tragedy that had occurred there. The official verdict came swiftly. Accidental poisoning from a misidentified botanical specimen Harmond had been carrying, a risk of his profession. But Lysandra had seen the look in Alaric's eyes as they carried away the body. He believed otherwise, as did she. More disturbing were Thaddeus's insinuations about her father's connection to Ravencroft. She'd written immediately to her father, receiving only a terse reply. The past is better left buried. Focus on your present duties. Alaric withdrew into himself, spending long hours in his study and avoiding her company. The ease that had begun developing between them vanished, replaced by a wary distance that ached more than Lysandra cared to admit. You're avoiding me, she said one evening, entering his study without knocking. He looked up from a stack of correspondence, shadows beneath his eyes, betraying sleepless nights. I've been occupied with estate matters, and with secrets. She closed the door behind her. Why was my father at Ravencroft the night your parents died? Alaric went utterly still, his face blanking of all expression. Who told you that? Does it matter? Is it true? He rose slowly, circling his desk to stand before her. Where did you hear this, Lysandra? Octavia and Thaddeus implied similar connections. Something dangerous flashed in his eyes. Of course they did. They've been waiting years for this opportunity. Opportunity for what? To tell me the truth you've concealed? To manipulate you with half-truths and calculated revelations? He raked a hand through his hair, a rare gesture of agitation. Yes, your father was here that night. He had business dealings with mine. What kind of business? Investment in a shipping venture. Nothing unusual. The same venture whose failure had ruined her family. Coincidence seemed increasingly implausible. And the accident that killed your parents? Was it truly an accident? Pain crossed his features before he masked it. The carriage overturned on the road to London. The wheels failed on a sharp curve. My mother died instantly. My father lingered for hours. And you believe this was somehow connected to my father? I never said that. His jaw tightened. This conversation serves no purpose, Lysandra. It serves the purpose of honesty between husband and wife. She stepped closer, refusing to be intimidated by his imposing presence. Octavia suggested my father's business began failing immediately after your parents' deaths. That seems a remarkable coincidence. Life is full of remarkable coincidences. And convenient lies, she countered. I deserve the truth, Alaric. For a moment, she thought he might finally confide in her. Then the study door burst open, revealing Thornfield. Your Grace, forgive the interruption, the butler said, more agitated than Lysandra had ever seen him. There's been a break-in at the East Wing. Alaric's expression hardened. Where? The music room, sir. The lock was forced. Without another word, Alaric strode from the study, Lysandra following close behind. They hurried through corridors to the East Wing, where servants gathered outside the previously locked room, whispering anxiously. Leave us, Alaric commanded, and the servants scattered instantly. The door to the music room stood ajar, its ornate lock splintered. Alaric hesitated on the threshold, a muscle working in his jaw. Stay here, he told Lysandra. No. She placed her hand on his arm, feeling the tension vibrating through him. Together. After a moment's hesitation, he nodded curtly and pushed the door fully open. The music room was frozen in time. A large pianoforte dominated the center. Sheet music still spread across its stand as if awaiting a player's return. Elegant chairs arranged for an audience, a harp in one corner, and tall windows that would have flooded the space with light had the heavy curtains not been drawn. A fine layer of dust covered everything, disturbed now by fresh footprints crossing the parquet floor. What were they looking for? Lysandra whispered. Alaric moved to the pianoforte, examining it carefully. Nothing was taken, he said, relief evident in his voice. Then his gaze fixed on something beneath the instrument. No. He knelt, reaching under the pianoforte to extract a small object, a gold locket on a delicate chain. What is it? Lysandra asked. His face had gone deathly pale. My mother's. She was wearing it the night she died. He opened the locket, revealing a miniature portrait of a woman with Alaric's grey eyes and a gentle smile. It was missing from her body. How did it get here? It couldn't have been here all these years. His voice had a dangerous edge. Someone planted it. Recently. The implications hung heavy in the silence between them. This was no random break-in, but a calculated message. Someone had access to evidence from the night of his parents' deaths. Alaric, Lysandra began cautiously. Could Thaddeus? Don't say his name. The command was harsh, his knuckles white around the locket. Not here. Not in her room. A new voice joined them from the doorway. Ah, family secrets. How inconvenient when they refuse to remain buried. Thaddeus Blackwood lounged against the doorframe, elegantly attired as always, a mocking smile playing across features too similar to Alaric's. Get out, Alaric growled, rising to his full height. Is that any way to greet family? Thaddeus stepped into the room, ignoring the command. Especially when I come bearing information about poor Harmon's unfortunate demise. Lord Harmon's death was an accident, Lysandra said firmly. Thaddeus's gaze shifted to her, something predatory in his assessment. Was it? Just like the accident that killed Alaric's parents? Just like the accidental financial ruin of your father? He turned back to Alaric. So many accidents. One might begin to question the laws of probability. State your business and get out, Alaric demanded. My business? Thaddeus affected surprise. I merely thought the Duke and Duchess should know that their botanist friend was investigating certain anomalies in the records of the old Duke's death before his own tragic accident. What anomalies? Lysandra asked despite herself. Lysandra, Alaric warned. Thaddeus smiled, triumph in his eyes. Harmond was a man of science, you see, fascinated by the properties of plants, including those that might cause metal to fatigue and snap when subjected to pressure. Like perhaps carriage wheels on a sharp curve. The blood drained from Alaric's face. You dare. I dare many things, cousin, including telling your lovely wife the truth about her father's part in all this. My father had nothing to do with any accident, Lysandra insisted. No? Thaddeus raised an eyebrow. Then why did he receive a substantial payment from the late Duke's private accounts 3 days before the accident? Why did those funds disappear immediately after the deaths? And why, he paused for effect, was his signature on documents authorizing modifications to the Duke's carriage just hours before it departed Ravencroft? The accusation hung in the air like poison. Lysandra felt the room tilt beneath her feet, certainties crumbling like sand. You're lying, she whispered. Am I? Thaddeus withdrew a folded document from his coat. Your husband has known the truth for years. Why do you think he sought you out for marriage? Love? Attraction to your charming personality? He laughed softly. No, my dear Duchess, he married you for vengeance. Enough! Alaric lunged forward, seizing Thaddeus by his immaculate cravat. Get out before I throw you out. Still hiding from the truth, cousin? Thaddeus didn't resist, maintaining his mocking smile despite Alaric's grip. How disappointing. I had hoped for more spine in the Duke of Ravencroft. Alaric released him with a shove toward the door. You have 10 minutes to leave Ravencroft before I set the dogs on you. I'm going. Thaddeus straightened his cravat with exaggerated care. But this, he placed the folded document on the pianoforte, stays. Your wife deserves to know exactly what kind of man she married and what kind of man her father is. He departed with a flourish, leaving behind a silence thick with unspoken accusations. Lysandra stared at the document, afraid to touch it yet unable to ignore it. Is it true? She asked, her voice barely audible. Did you marry me for revenge against my father? Alaric didn't answer immediately, his face a rigid mask as he battled some internal conflict. Finally he said, Our marriage was arranged for mutual benefit. Your family needed financial salvation. I needed an heir. That's not an answer. It's the only one I can give right now. He moved to the pianoforte and took the document, tucking it inside his coat without opening it. Thaddeus is a manipulator and a liar. Remember that before you believe anything he says. And are you a liar too, Alaric? The question escaped before she could stop it, torn from the deepest fear in her heart. Pain flashed across his face, genuine and raw. I have never lied to you, Lysandra. Not directly, but there are truths I've withheld, believing them better left in the past. The past shapes our present, she said quietly. If my father was somehow involved in your parents' deaths, stop. His voice was sharper than she'd ever heard it. This is precisely what Thaddeus wants, to drive a wedge between us, to reopen old wounds. Then tell me the truth and prove him wrong. I can't. The words exploded from him, echoing against the silent instruments. Not yet. Not until I'm certain. Certain of what? Instead of answering, he crossed to her, taking her hands in his. The gesture was so unexpected, so unlike his usual reserved demeanor that she froze. Trust me, he said, his eyes searching hers. Give me time to untangle this web Thaddeus has spun. Once I know the complete truth, I swear you'll know it too. She wanted to believe him. The weeks of growing closeness, the glimpses of the man behind the cold facade, those couldn't all be fabrications, could they? How much time? She asked. A few days. No more. She withdrew her hands from his. And until then? Are we to pretend nothing has changed? Everything has changed, he said quietly. From the moment you stepped into Ravencroft, nothing has been the same. The weight of unspoken sentiment in his words caught her off guard. What do you mean? For a moment he seemed on the verge of some confession. Then with visible effort he stepped back, rebuilding the walls between them. You should rest, he said. It's been a difficult day. Alaric, please, Lysandra. Give me these few days. She studied his face, the strain around his eyes, the rigid set of his jaw, and nodded reluctantly. 3 days. Then I want the truth, all of it, regardless of how painful. You have my word. But as she left the music room, doubt gnawed at her certainties. If Alaric had married her for revenge, had every moment between them been calculated, every kindness a step in some elaborate plan. That night, unable to sleep, Lysandra made a decision. If answers wouldn't come to her, she would seek them out herself, starting with the document Thaddeus had left, the one Alaric had so quickly concealed. She slipped from her bed and donned a dressing gown, moving silently through the darkened corridors of Ravencroft House. Alaric's study door was locked, but she had observed where he kept the key, hidden behind a particular volume of Shakespeare in the library. The study lay in shadow, moonlight filtering through the window to illuminate the massive desk. She lit a single candle, careful to shield its light from the door, and began searching the drawers. In the bottom drawer, beneath ledgers and correspondence, she found it, a wooden box secured with a small lock. The key to his desk also opened this box, revealing a collection of documents, letters, and a sealed envelope addressed in flowing script. For my son, Alaric, to be opened upon my death. Her fingers trembled as she removed the letter, recognizing it as the last communication from Alaric's father. The seal was broken. Alaric had read it years ago. She hesitated, knowing this invasion of his privacy crossed a line that might never be redrawn. But Thaddeus's accusations burned in her mind. If her father was implicated in the deaths of Alaric's parents, she needed to know. She unfolded the letter, holding it close to the candle flame. "My dear son," it began in a shaking hand. "If you are reading this, then my suspicions were correct, and I have not survived to tell you in person. Trust no one. The contract with Thorn was altered. Examine the signatures closely. Whatever happens, remember that your mother and I—" "What are you doing?" Lysandra whirled around, heart leaping to her throat. Alaric stood in the doorway, his expression a terrible blend of disbelief and betrayal. "I needed to know," she whispered, the letter trembling in her hand. "So you break into my private papers in the middle of the night?" The cold fury in his voice was worse than any shouting. "Read my father's last words without permission? You left me no choice. You've hidden the truth from me since the day we met. And this is how you seek truth? Through theft and deception." He crossed the room in 3 strides, snatching the letter from her hand. "Get out. Alaric, please, get out." Each word fell like ice. "I was a fool to think you different from the rest. A fool to think what grew between us was real." The accusation struck like a physical blow. "What grew between us was real for me," she said, fighting to keep her voice steady. "Was it real for you, or was I merely a pawn in your game of revenge?" For a moment, raw emotion broke through his mask. Pain, anger, and something else. Something that might have been the beginning of love, now shattered by distrust. "It doesn't matter now," he said flatly. "We're done. Alaric, we're done, Lysandra. Pack your things. Tomorrow you return to your father where you belong." He turned away, shoulders rigid with barely contained fury, leaving her alone in the study with the ruins of what might have been scattered around her like ashes. Rain lashed against the windows of the small cottage, mirroring the storm in Lysandra's heart. 3 days had passed since her banishment from Ravencroft. 3 days in this humble dwelling, owned by her former governess, Miss Eudora Finch, in a village far enough from Ravencroft to avoid gossip, but close enough that news still travelled, and the news was grim indeed. Thaddeus Blackwood had been seen frequently at Ravencroft House. Lady Octavia had been spotted driving through the gates in her elegant carriage, and Alaric, according to hushed whispers in the village, had fallen into a black mood that sent servants scurrying from his path. "You must eat something, child," Miss Finch urged, placing a bowl of soup before Lysandra. The elderly woman's face creased with concern, her once sharp eyes softened by age but still missing nothing. "Starving yourself won't solve anything." "Nothing will solve this," Lysandra replied, pushing the bowl away. "My husband believes I betrayed him. My father refuses to even see me." After being dismissed from Ravencroft, she had gone first to her father's modest rooms in London, only to find them emptied, the landlady claiming Mr. Thorn had departed suddenly the previous day, leaving no forwarding address. "Perhaps," Miss Finch suggested carefully, "there is more to this story than either man has shared with you." "Undoubtedly," Lysandra agreed bitterly. "Secrets seem to be the Blackwood family currency, and yet you love him." It wasn't a question, and Lysandra didn't bother denying it. Somewhere amidst the cold formality and cautious revelations, Alaric Blackwood had claimed her heart. His rare smiles, his passion for poetry hidden beneath aristocratic reserve, his unexpected kindnesses, all had woven a spell she couldn't break, even now. "My love changes nothing," she said. "He believes I betrayed his trust. He'll never forgive that." Miss Finch's eyes sharpened. And did you betray his trust? I read his father's letter without permission. Shame colored her admission. I was desperate for answers about my father's involvement in his parents' deaths. And did this letter provide those answers? No. I only read part of it before Alaric found me. Lysandra traced patterns in the wood grain of the table. It mentioned a contract with my father that had been altered, and told Alaric to examine the signatures closely. Miss Finch nodded thoughtfully. What did your father say when you asked him about all this? Nothing. He's vanished completely. Fresh worry gnawed at her. Miss Finch, I fear something has happened to him. It's not like father to disappear without word, especially knowing I've been sent away from Ravencroft. Unless, the older woman said carefully, your father had reason to believe you were in danger at Ravencroft. Danger? From Alaric? Despite everything, Lysandra rejected the notion instantly. He may be cold, even cruel when angered, but he would never harm me physically. Not all danger comes from one's husband, my dear. Miss Finch rose with the stiffness of age and moved to a small secretary desk in the corner. I received a letter yesterday that may interest you. Lysandra took the proffered envelope with trembling fingers. From my father. Indeed, he knew you might seek shelter with me if trouble arose. Miss Finch's expression grew grave. He enclosed something else as well. From a drawer, she extracted a small packet wrapped in oilcloth. He instructed me to give you this only if you came to me in distress, saying it might provide answers you seek. The packet contained several folded documents and a brief note in her father's familiar handwriting. My dearest daughter, forgive a foolish man's mistakes. The enclosed copies may help you understand what truly happened 9 years ago. I have gone to gather final proof of Thaddeus's treachery. By the time you read this, I pray I will have succeeded. Your loving father. With growing dread, Lysandra unfolded the first document, a contract between her father's company and the late Duke of Ravencroft, dated 9 years earlier. The second was apparently the same contract, but with subtle differences in wording regarding the specifications for carriage repairs to be performed by Thorn Enterprises. The third document froze her blood, a bank draft showing payment from Thaddeus Blackwood to her father's chief clerk, Morris, dated 1 day before the Duke's fatal accident. Oh God, she whispered, connecting the fragments into a horrifying picture. Thaddeus bribed Morris to alter the specifications for the carriage repairs. The wheels failed because they weren't properly reinforced. Miss Finch leaned forward, her expression grim. And your father? He signed the original contract, not the altered one. Lysandra examined the signatures closely, noting subtle differences. This signature on the altered contract, it's similar but not identical to my father's hand. It's a forgery. Which means my father was framed for the deaths of Alaric's parents. The realization struck like lightning. But why would Thaddeus want his uncle and aunt dead? She spread the documents across the table, searching for answers. Among them was a partial copy of the late Duke's will, showing revisions made shortly before his death. One provision stood out starkly. Should my son Alaric die without legitimate issue, all properties and titles shall pass to my nephew, Thaddeus Blackwood. The pieces aligned with terrible clarity. Thaddeus arranged the accident hoping to kill the entire family, including Alaric, who was supposed to travel with his parents that night. But Alaric survived, Miss Finch noted. Yes, and inherited everything. Thaddeus couldn't touch him then. Lysandra's mind raced. But if Alaric dies without an heir, Thaddeus inherits Ravencroft. Terror seized her heart. My father has gone to confront Thaddeus with proof of his crimes. He's in danger. And Alaric... She stood abruptly. I must return to Ravencroft immediately. In this storm? Miss Finch protested. The roads will be impassable. I have no choice, Lysandra said, already gathering the documents. If my father confronts Thaddeus alone, he'll be killed. And if Thaddeus has truly set his sights on the dukedom again, she didn't complete the thought. Harmon's death had been no accident. He had discovered something connecting Thaddeus to the Duke's death. How many other accidents might Thaddeus arrange to clear his path to Ravencroft? Within the hour, Lysandra had borrowed Miss Finch's ancient but sturdy mare and set out through the driving rain. The 5-mile journey to Ravencroft stretched endlessly, the road a river of mud that threatened to swallow horse and rider with each step. Lightning split the sky, illuminating Ravencroft House on its promontory just as she approached the gates. No lights shone from the lower windows, though a single lamp burned in what she recognized as Alaric's study. The front door stood ajar, an unthinkable lapse in the orderly household. No footman appeared as she entered, dripping rainwater onto the marble floor of the entrance hall. The house felt wrong, too quiet, too empty, as if it held its breath in anticipation of tragedy. A muffled crash echoed from the direction of Alaric's study, followed by raised voices. Lysandra gathered her sodden skirts and ran, heart pounding against her ribs. The study door was locked. She pounded against it, calling Alaric's name, but the voices inside continued unabated. Something heavy struck the door from inside, the impact reverberating through the wood. Desperate, she remembered the connecting door between the study and the adjacent morning room. She raced there, finding it unlocked, and slipped through the darkened room toward the study. Through the partially open connecting door, she saw 3 men, Alaric standing with his back to the fireplace, face bloodied but defiant. Her father, restrained by Thaddeus, who pressed a small pistol against his temple. "Sign it," Thaddeus demanded, shoving a document toward Alaric. "Sign it now, or Thorn dies first, then you." "Don't," her father urged, despite the gun at his head. "He'll kill us both anyway." "Shut up!" Thaddeus struck him with the pistol, drawing blood from his temple. "You've caused enough trouble with your confessions and your evidence. Did you really think I wouldn't be watching when you return to your old offices? The magistrate already has copies," her father said, blood trickling down his face. "You can't silence the truth any longer." Thaddeus laughed, a sound devoid of humor. "The magistrate is currently investigating a tragic fire at his offices. Such a shame about all those documents." "You won't succeed," Alaric said, his voice deadly calm despite the blood staining his shirt. "Even if you kill us both, the entail prevents you from selling Ravencroft properties. The title is worthless without the fortune, which remains in trust." "Unless," Thaddeus smiled coldly, "the Duke signs everything over to his cousin before his tragic suicide, driven mad by the revelation of his wife's infidelity, perhaps. I heard she was caught reading your private papers. Such a betrayal." Rage and fear battled within Lysandra's chest as she surveyed the room, searching for a weapon, an advantage, anything to tip the scales. Her gaze fell on the heavy brass fire poker leaning against the hearth, just behind Alaric. Moving silently into the room, she caught her father's eye first. A flash of recognition, quickly masked to avoid alerting Thaddeus. Then Alaric turned slightly, perhaps sensing her presence, and their eyes met across the room. 1,000 emotions passed between them in that single glance. Regret, fear, determination, and something deeper that neither had dared name. He gave an almost imperceptible nod, understanding her intent without words. "I'll sign," Alaric said suddenly, turning toward the desk, positioning himself to block Thaddeus's view of Lysandra. "Release Thorn first." "Do you take me for a fool?" Thaddeus snarled. "Sign, then he goes free. Swear it on your mother's grave." The deliberate provocation had its intended effect. Thaddeus's face contorted with fury. "My mother died because your father preferred his common-born musician to the woman he was supposed to marry. Don't you dare speak of her." In his rage, Thaddeus's grip on Percival Thorn loosened fractionally. It was enough. Her father drove his elbow into Thaddeus's ribs, causing him to stumble backward. In the same moment, Alaric lunged forward, tackling his cousin. The pistol discharged with a deafening crack, the ball embedding itself in the ceiling. Lysandra seized her opportunity, darting forward to grab the fire poker. As the men grappled on the floor, Thaddeus rolling on top with his hands around Alaric's throat, she brought the heavy brass down with all her strength onto Thaddeus's shoulder. He howled in pain, his grip loosening enough for Alaric to throw him off. The pistol skittered across the floor, coming to rest at Percival Thorn's feet. He snatched it up, training it steadily on Thaddeus. "Enough," her father said, voice firm despite his injuries. "It's over, Blackwood." Thaddeus glared up at them from the floor, hatred contorting his handsome features. "You think this changes anything? One word from me about your precious daughter's common origins, and society will shun the great Duke of Ravencroft. One hint of scandal about your father's involvement in the accident, and your reputation is destroyed." "My father had no involvement," Alaric said coldly, rising to his feet. "I know the truth now. Morris confessed everything before his convenient suicide last year. How you bribed him to alter the specifications, how you forged Thorn's signature. You can prove nothing." "We have the original contract," Lysandra said, stepping forward with the documents from her father, "and the bank draft showing your payment to Morris, and my father's sworn testimony." Thaddeus's expression shifted from rage to calculation. "Cousins shouldn't quarrel," he said, his tone suddenly conciliatory. "We can reach an arrangement." "The only arrangement," Alaric cut him off, "is that you will board a ship for the colonies tonight, never to return to England. Otherwise you face trial for 2 murders, my parents and Lord Harmond." "3, came a new voice from the doorway. Isolde Blackwood stood there, elegant even at this late hour, a sealed letter in her hand. He also killed Morris. I have proof. Thaddeus's face drained of color. Isolde, darling, what nonsense. Save your charm, she said coldly. I found your letters to Morris in your rooms. You promised him money, position, me as his wife, all lies to secure his cooperation. You searched my rooms? Thaddeus sputtered. After I saw you place the locket in the music room. Her gaze shifted to Alaric. I suspected for years, but couldn't prove it. When he returned, I knew he would try again. Your own cousin? Lysandra asked, still struggling to comprehend such calculated evil. He never considered us family, Isolde said bitterly. Only obstacles to what he believed should be his. In the tense silence that followed, the sound of horses and men's voices approached from outside. The magistrate and his constables, alerted by servants who had fled when Thaddeus first arrived. It seems your choices have narrowed considerably, Alaric told his cousin. The gallows or exile. Thaddeus's gaze darted between them, the cornered predator seeking escape. For a moment, Lysandra thought he might lunge for the pistol. Instead, his shoulders slumped in defeat. I'll take exile, he said sullenly. Within the hour, Thaddeus was in custody, the magistrate taking statements in the drawing room. Servants bustled about, bringing bandages and brandy, restoring order to the chaos. In the aftermath, Lysandra found herself alone with her father in the library, both exhausted, but needing to address the truth at last. Why didn't you tell me? She asked. He sighed, looking older than his years. At first, I believed it truly was my fault, that somehow I had missed a flaw in the wheels. By the time Morris hinted at Thaddeus's involvement, years had passed. Your mother was gone, our business ruined. What good would accusations against a powerful family do? Alaric deserved to know the truth. Yes, he admitted, I was a coward. When he approached me about the marriage, I thought perhaps it was a chance to make amends, to set things right without reopening old wounds. He married me believing you responsible for his parents' deaths, she said, pain sharp in her voice. Her father met her gaze directly. No, child. He married you because when we met to discuss the arrangement, I gave him Morris's deathbed confession exonerating me. He knew the truth before he ever offered for you. Shock rendered her momentarily speechless. Then why? Ask him yourself, her father said, nodding toward the door where Alaric stood, watching them with unreadable eyes. Mr. Thorne, Alaric said formally, might I have a moment alone with my wife? Her father squeezed her hand before departing, closing the door softly behind him. Silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken words. Alaric's face bore the marks of Thaddeus's attack, a cut above his eye bruising along his jaw. Yet he stood tall and straight, pride intact despite everything. You came back, he said at last. Despite how cruelly I sent you away, I discovered the truth. I couldn't let you face Thaddeus alone. Even though you believed I married you for revenge? She met his gaze steadily. My father says you knew the truth before our marriage, that you knew he was innocent. I did. He took a step toward her, then stopped as if uncertain of his welcome. Morris sent a confession to me just before his death, naming Thaddeus as the architect of my parents' murder. When I confronted your father, he confirmed it with additional evidence. Then why marry me? Why not simply bring Thaddeus to justice then? We lacked proof that would stand in court, and Thaddeus was abroad beyond our reach. He ran a hand through his disheveled hair. As for marrying you, I needed an heir to secure Ravencroft from Thaddeus's claim, should anything happen to me. Your father needed financial security. A business arrangement, she said flatly, echoing his words from their first meeting. Nothing more. At first, yes, he admitted. I was not prepared for you, Lysandra. For your intelligence, your compassion, your courage, I expected a meek, grateful bride. Instead, I found a woman who challenged me at every turn, who saw through the walls I'd built, who made me remember how to live rather than merely exist. Her heart quickened at his words, but doubt still lingered. Yet you kept the truth from me. Let me believe terrible things about my own father, rather than trust me with the truth. I was wrong, he said simply. I've spent so many years trusting no one, keeping secrets close, that openness no longer comes naturally to me. But that's no excuse. No, she agreed. It isn't. He closed the distance between them, stopping just short of touching her. When I found you reading my father's letter, I reacted from hurt pride, not reason. I thought for one terrible moment that perhaps Thaddeus had enlisted you as well, that everything between us had been a lie. How could you believe that? After everything we'd shared? Because losing you would hurt more than anything I've ever experienced, he said, raw honesty in his voice. And I've spent 9 years expecting the worst from everyone around me. It was easier to push you away than risk a deeper betrayal. His confession hung in the air between them, more intimate than any physical touch. And now? She asked softly. Now I'm asking if there's any chance you might forgive me, he said, vulnerability evident in his grey eyes. If we might begin again with truth between us this time. Truth, she repeated, including the truth of your feelings? Colour touched his cheeks, but he didn't look away. The truth is that I love you, Lysandra. Not as part of any arrangement or plan, not for convenience or duty. I love your mind, your heart, your unwavering courage. I love the woman who defied an aristocrat's scorn to defend a servant, who rode through a storm to save a family she barely knew, who faced down a murderer to protect those she loves. He took her hand tentatively, as if expecting rejection. I don't deserve your forgiveness or your love, but I'm asking for both anyway because these months with you have shown me that life without you would be returning to darkness after finally seeing light. Tears blurred her vision as she studied the proud, difficult man before her, the man who had married her for convenience and somehow, against all odds, had given her his heart along the way. There will be no more secrets between us, she said, making it a condition, not a question. None, he promised. Whatever comes, we face it together. And you'll stop treating me as something fragile to be protected from truth. I will try, he said, with a hint of his old wry humor. Though I make no promises about trying to protect you from actual physical danger, you seem to court it with alarming regularity. A smile tugged at her lips despite herself. And the music room? Will you keep it locked forever? Pain flashed across his face, but he answered honestly, No, it's time to let my mother's memory live in music again, not silence. She raised her hand to his face, gently touching the bruise forming along his jaw. I love you too, Alaric. Despite your pride and your secrets, and your infuriating tendency to think you know what's best for everyone. Relief transformed his features, years of tension melting away as he pulled her into his arms. My impossible, magnificent wife, he murmured against her hair. How did a cold-hearted duke like me ever deserve you? Perhaps you're not as cold-hearted as you pretend, she suggested, tilting her face up to his. Their lips met in a kiss that held both apology and promise, the promise of truth between them, of barriers finally broken, of a love powerful enough to overcome pride and misunderstanding. Outside, the storm that had raged all evening began to subside, rain softening to a gentle patter against the windows. Dawn would bring clear skies and the beginning of spring, a fitting metaphor, Lysandra thought, for the new beginning they had found together. Not a perfect fairy tale ending, but something richer and more enduring. Two flawed people choosing to love each other honestly, with all their scars and secrets finally laid bare.